Hey, welcome to my channel. I hope you enjoy tonight's stories. Here we venture into the dark web, peeling back layers of mystery and terror to reveal tales that were never meant to be told. Leave a like and subscribe for more dark web scary stories. I found a dark website that lists unnatural births. My birthday and hospital are on the list. I wasn't looking for anything sinister. I wasn't even looking for anything that interesting. It started as one of those nights when sleep feels impossible and you're just aimlessly scrolling, hoping to find something to pass the time. The deep web wasn't new to me. I'd explored it a few times before, mostly out of curiosity, but I'd always stayed far away from the truly dark corners. No weird marketplaces, no shady chat rooms, nothing I couldn't explain later if someone found out. This time, though, something caught my eye. I was browsing a forum I hadn't seen before. It wasn't flashy, just plain text on a black background, but the topics were all over the place. Some were harmless, like conspiracy theories or survivalist tips. Others were weirder, threads about the unseen ones or places you can't find on maps. But it was one specific thread that pulled me in, the Registry of Unnatural Births. It sounded like clickbait. I clicked anyway. The page loaded slowly like it was hesitating. When it finally opened, my screen was filled with a simple table. No ads, no comments, just rows of data. Dates, names of hospitals, and a column labelled ID. The dates went back decades, some as far as the 1930s, but the most recent ones were as recent as last month. At first, I thought it was some kind of weird historical record, maybe an archive of births from unusual places. But then I noticed something strange. None of the entries had last names. Just first names, hospitals, and those cryptic ID numbers. I scrolled down, skimming through the list without much thought, until I saw something that made my stomach drop. My birthday, my hospital, my name. I stared at the screen, my pulse pounding in my ears. It couldn't be real. It had to be some kind of coincidence. There were thousands of entries on this site. How hard would it be for one of them to match my details? But as much as I tried to convince myself, I couldn't shake the unease creeping up my spine. The ID number next to my name stood out, 117B72. It didn't mean anything to me, but the column header, ID, made it feel important. Like it was more than just a random string of characters. I wanted to close the page. I wanted to shut my laptop and pretend I hadn't seen it. But something about the list kept pulling me back. I scrolled back up to the top, scanning the entries more carefully this time. Some of the names were familiar, or at least sounded like they could be. Common names like Sarah or David. But others weren't names at all. Just symbols or words that didn't belong. Void, silence, or worse, stillborn. That's when I noticed the notes. At the very bottom of the page, in tiny, almost unreadable text, was a message. For inquiries, contact admin _347. I shouldn't have done it. I knew that even as I was typing out the message. But my curiosity had always been my worst enemy, and this was no different. I clicked the link, which opened a blank chat window. A single cursor blinked at the bottom, waiting for me to type something. Hi! I saw my name on the list. I hovered over the send button, hesitating for what felt like forever, before finally clicking it. The message disappeared and I leaned back, already regretting it. The response came almost instantly. Name? ID? I swallowed hard, my hands shaking as I typed. My name, ID 117B72. Another pause, longer this time. I stared at the screen, my heart racing, until finally another message popped up. You were marked. Do you know why? Marked? What the hell did that mean? My fingers hovered over the keyboard, unsure how to respond. Finally, I typed the only thing that came to mind. Number What does it mean? There was another long pause. Then the next message came, and I felt my blood run cold. You weren't supposed to survive. I stared at the words, my mind racing. Before I could respond, another message appeared. Stay offline. They'll notice now. Then, just like that, the chat window closed itself. The page refreshed, and the list of names was gone. In its place was a single line of text. 404 error, page not found. I sat there for what felt like hours, staring at the empty screen. None of it made sense. The list, the ID, the cryptic messages. What did it even mean? I tried to convince myself it was just a sick joke, maybe some elaborate prank by a bored hacker, but deep down I knew it wasn't. The feeling of being watched started that night. It wasn't anything obvious, no footsteps outside my window, no strange cars parked on the street. Just a subtle, creeping sensation that I wasn't alone, even when I was. Like there was something just out of sight, waiting for me to let my guard down. By the next morning, I was convinced I'd overreacted. Lack of sleep, too much caffeine, and my overactive imagination had to be to blame. I decided to forget the whole thing, to push it to the back of my mind and move on. But when I opened my laptop that afternoon, there was an email waiting for me. No subject line, no sender name. Just a single sentence. 117B72 has been activated. The email sat there, staring back at me, daring me to make sense of it. The words 117B72 has been activated, burned into my mind, looping endlessly. I didn't know what it meant, and honestly, I didn't want to find out. But ignoring it wasn't an option either. My hands hovered over the keyboard, unsure of what to do. Replying seemed like a bad idea. Clicking on anything, even worse. I decided to leave it alone, shutting my laptop and pushing it to the edge of the table like it was a ticking time bomb. But as I sat there, the silence in my apartment became deafening. The usual hum of the fridge, the faint creaks of the old building. They were all gone. It felt like the world was holding its breath. I tried to go about my day, but I couldn't shake the unease. Every time I looked at my laptop, I felt like it was watching me, waiting for me to open it again. Finally, after what felt like hours, I caved. I powered it back on, my stomach twisting as the screen lit up. The email was gone. Not in the trash, not archived, not in any folder I could think to check. It had just vanished. My heart pounded as I scrolled through my inbox, hoping I'd imagined the whole thing, but deep down I knew I hadn't. That's when I noticed the second change. My laptop's wallpaper was different. It used to be a picture of a hiking trail I'd visited last summer, but now it was solid black. In the center of the screen, faintly glowing, was a single line of text. Check your surroundings. I felt the blood drain from my face. My hands trembled as I looked around my apartment, half expecting someone to be standing in the corner. But everything looked normal. My couch, my bookshelf, the pile of laundry I'd been putting off for days. Nothing seemed out of place. But the feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. I locked the doors, checked the windows, even peeked into my closet just to reassure myself. No one was there. I was alone. Or at least, I should have been. I sat back down at my desk, staring at the laptop, trying to decide what to do next. That's when my phone buzzed. I nearly jumped out of my chair, the sound cutting through the silence like a gunshot. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. Stop ignoring the signs. I wanted to throw my phone across the room, to smash it into pieces and pretend none of this was happening. Instead, I typed back the only thing I could think of. Who is this? The response came almost instantly. Look closer. Look closer at what? The laptop? my phone, my surroundings. Every nerve in my body was on edge. I opened my laptop again, but this time the text on the screen had changed. "You're not alone." I froze. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment I couldn't move. The words seemed to pulse on the screen like they were alive. Slowly I reached for the webcam at the top of my laptop and covered it with a piece of tape. It didn't help. The feeling of being watched only grew stronger. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, barely audible over the pounding of my own heart. A soft, rhythmic tapping coming from somewhere behind me. Tap, tap, tap. I turned around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. The tapping continued, louder now. It wasn't random, it was deliberate, like someone knocking on a door. But there was no door behind me, just the wall. I backed away from the desk, my eyes darting around the room, trying to make sense of what I was hearing. The tapping grew louder still, echoing in my ears until it stopped abruptly. And then from the other side of the wall I heard a voice, faint, muffled, but unmistakably real. "Let me in." I didn't think. I bolted for the door, grabbing my keys on the way out. My legs felt like jelly as I stumbled down the stairs of my building, my heart pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I didn't stop until I was outside, standing under the harsh glow of the streetlights. It was late, the streets mostly empty, but the cool night air was a relief. I leaned against a lamppost, trying to catch my breath, my mind racing. None of this made sense. The dark website, the email, the texts, the voice behind the wall, it all felt like a bad dream I couldn't wake up from. I pulled out my phone, half expecting another text, but the screen was blank. No new messages, no missed calls. For a moment, I thought maybe I'd imagined everything. Maybe I was losing it. Then my phone buzzed again. It was a picture this time. My blood ran cold as I opened it. It was a photo of my apartment taken from inside. The angle was high, like it had been taken from the ceiling, and it showed the exact spot where I'd been sitting just minutes ago. Beneath the photo was a single line of text. "You left too soon." I didn't go back to my apartment that night. I couldn't. The thought of walking back into that place, knowing someone, or something, was watching me, was enough to make my skin crawl. Instead, I drove to a 24-hour diner on the other side of town, the kind of place where no one asks questions if you sit in a booth for hours, nursing a cup of coffee. The fluorescent lights buzzed faintly as I stared at my phone, waiting for another message. My mind was racing, trying to connect the dots. The dark website, the ID, the voice behind the wall, and now this. Who was doing this to me, and why? I glanced around the diner. A handful of late-night regulars were scattered across the room. An old man reading a newspaper, a couple whispering to each other in a corner booth, a waitress refilling someone's coffee. Everything looked so normal, but after what I'd just been through, I couldn't shake the feeling that someone in that diner was watching me. That's when my phone buzzed again. The message was short, but it hit me like a punch to the gut. "You're not alone." I looked up instinctively, scanning the room. The couple in the corner were still whispering, the old man was still reading, and the waitress was pouring coffee for someone new, someone who wasn't there a minute ago. A man in a dark hoodie sat at the counter, his back to me. He wasn't eating or drinking, just sitting there, perfectly still. My heart pounded as I stared at him, willing him to turn around, to do something. But he didn't move. His shoulders were rigid, his posture unnaturally straight, like he was waiting for something. Then my phone buzzed again. This time it was a picture. A photo of me sitting in the diner, taken from behind. My blood ran cold as I looked up, scanning the room again, There was no one near me, no one holding a phone, no one who could have taken the picture. I grabbed my bag and slid out of the booth, trying to stay calm. My eyes darted around the room as I headed for the exit, keeping my head low. When I stepped outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I looked back through the diner's window, but the man in the hoodie was gone. I didn't go home. Instead, I drove aimlessly, trying to put as much distance as I could between me and whatever was happening. After an hour of driving, I found myself parked outside an old motel on the edge of town. It was the kind of place you'd only stay in if you had no other options, but at that moment, it felt like the safest place in the world. The woman at the front desk didn't ask any questions when I checked in. She barely even looked at me, just handed me a key and muttered something about checkout times. I thanked her and headed to my room, locking the door behind me and sliding the chain into place. The room was small and smelled faintly of mildew, but it was quiet. Safe. I sat on the edge of the bed, my phone still clutched in my hand, half expecting another message to pop up. But for the first time all night, my screen stayed dark. I let out a shaky breath and set the phone down, forcing myself to relax. Maybe this was over. Maybe whoever was messing with me had lost interest. But even as I tried to convince myself, a thought nagged at the back of my mind. What did the ID mean? I couldn't let it go. The number 117B72 had to mean something. It was the only thread I had to pull, and I wasn't going to let it slip through my fingers. I pulled out my laptop, hesitating for a moment before connecting to the motel's Wi-Fi. A quick search for the ID brought up nothing. No matches, no explanations, just blank results. Frustrated, I tried searching for the dark website instead, hoping to find some trace of it. But no matter what keywords I used, it was like the site had never existed. I leaned back in my chair, rubbing my temples. I was running out of options. Then on a whim, I tried something else. I searched for the hospital where I was born. It wasn't much, but it felt like the only connection I had to the list. The hospital had a website, an old, barely functional page that looked like it hadn't been updated in years. I clicked through the links, skimming for anything that stood out, until I found a section labeled Historical Records. Most of the entries were exactly what you'd expect: old photos, outdated news articles, lists of former staff. But buried near the bottom of the page was a link titled Special Cases. I clicked. The page loaded slowly, each second feeling like an eternity. When it finally appeared, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a list of names or events. It was a scanned document, faded and torn, with the words Project Genesis stamped at the top in bold letters. The document was barely legible in places, but what I could read was enough to make my skin crawl. It talked about experimental births, about children born under unnatural circumstances. The exact details were blacked out, but phrases like genetic deviation and anomalous outcomes stood out like red flags. Toward the bottom of the document was a list of case numbers. My heart pounded as I scanned them, looking for something familiar. There it was. 117B72. My chest tightened as I stared at the number. This wasn't some random prank, it was real. Whatever this was, I was part of it. My fingers trembled as I scrolled down further, desperate for more answers. Then my laptop screen went black. At first, I thought the battery had died, but then a single line of text appeared in the center of the screen. You were warned. The laptop shut off completely. A second later, my phone buzzed. I picked it up with shaking hands, dreading what I'd see. The message was simple. You're not supposed to look. Then, as if on cue, the lights in the motel room flickered and went out. The darkness in the motel room was suffocating. It wasn't the kind of darkness you get when the lights go out. It was heavier, deeper, like the shadows themselves had come alive and swallowed the room whole. My breath caught in my throat as I gripped my phone tightly, its faint glow the only thing keeping me grounded. The silence didn't last long. From somewhere in the room, I heard it, a faint creak, like someone shifting their weight on the worn floorboards. My heart pounded in my chest as I scanned the room, my phone's dim light barely illuminating the space. The bed, the cheap desk, the door, they all looked normal. But the sound came again, closer this time, followed by a low, almost imperceptible hum. "Who's there?" I whispered, my voice trembling. No response. I backed toward the door, fumbling for the chain lock. My fingers brushed against the cold metal, but before I could undo it, my phone buzzed in my hand. The sudden vibration made me jump, nearly dropping it. The screen lit up with a new message from the same unknown number. "Don't move!" My entire body froze. I didn't dare breathe, let alone look around. The air in the room grew colder, and that hum... No, it wasn't a hum anymore. It was a whisper, faint and layered, like 100 voices murmuring just out of reach. I couldn't make out the words, but they felt wrong, like they didn't belong here. The floor creaked again, and this time I saw it. In the corner of the room, where the shadows were darkest, something moved. It wasn't a person, not exactly. It was taller, its limbs too long, its movements too jerky. Its shape was more suggestion than substance, like it was only partially real. The whispers grew louder as it stepped closer, its silhouette rippling like smoke. I gripped the doorknob, twisting it desperately, but it wouldn't budge. My other hand still clutched my phone, and I stared at the screen, hoping for another message, some kind of explanation. But the screen stayed dark, the glow fading as the battery finally died. The figure stopped at the edge of the light, its head tilting unnaturally as if studying me. I could feel its gaze even though it didn't have eyes. My entire body trembled as it leaned closer, its presence almost unbearable. Then it spoke. "You shouldn't have looked." The voice wasn't like anything I'd ever heard. It wasn't a single voice, it was all the whispers layered together, each one slightly out of sync. It sounded ancient, wrong, like it didn't belong in this world. My knees buckled, and I pressed myself against the door, wishing I could melt through it and escape. "What do you want?" I managed to choke out. It tilted its head again, the movement sharp and unnatural. "It isn't about what we want," it said. "It's about what you are." "I don't know what you're talking about," I shouted, my voice breaking. The shadows around it rippled, spreading across the floor like ink in water. "You were marked," it said. "From the moment you were born, you weren't supposed to survive, but you did, and now you're a mistake." The word hit me like a punch to the gut, a mistake. That's what the chat message had said. You weren't supposed to survive. I shook my head, tears streaming down my face. "I don't understand. What does that even mean?" "You will," it said. "Soon." Before I could respond, the shadows surged forward, swallowing the room. The cold was unbearable now, biting through my skin, and the whispers were deafening. I screamed, but the sound was lost in the cacophony. I felt myself falling, the ground giving way beneath me, and then... silence. When I opened my eyes, I was lying on the floor of the motel room. The lights were back on, flickering faintly, and the air felt normal again. But the figure was gone, and the room was empty. For a moment I thought maybe I'd passed out, that it had all been some kind of hallucination, but then I saw the mirror. The motel's cheap, cracked mirror hung on the wall opposite me, and it wasn't showing my reflection. Instead, it showed the room, but darker, twisted. The furniture was warped, the walls covered in strange symbols that pulsed faintly with light. And in the center of the room, where I had just been standing, was the figure. It stared back at me through the mirror, its head tilting again as it raised one impossibly long arm. It pointed at me, its featureless face somehow conveying a single, undeniable message. This isn't over. I scrambled to my feet, grabbed my bag, and ran. I didn't even bother checking out. I just got in my car and drove, my hands shaking so badly I could barely keep the wheel steady. I don't know how far I drove or how long I was on the road, but eventually I pulled over at a gas station. I sat in the car for a while, my heart still racing, before finally stepping out to get some air. The station was empty except for an old man behind the counter who didn't even look up as I walked in. I grabbed a bottle of water, my hands still trembling, and made my way to the register. That's when I saw it. On the wall behind the counter, next to a faded map of the state, was a small bulletin board covered in missing persons flyers. Dozens of faces stared back at me, their names and dates of disappearance written in neat black letters. One of the flyers caught my eye. It was newer than the others, the edges still crisp, and the face on it was mine. Underneath the photo, in bold black text, were the words 117B72 unresolved. The old man finally looked up, his eyes locking onto mine. He didn't say a word, but the look on his face said everything. He knew. The old man's gaze was like a spotlight, unblinking and heavy, rooting me to the spot. His eyes were dull and tired, but there was something else behind them, something that said he knew exactly who I was, or worse, what I was. My throat felt dry as I tried to speak, but no sound came out. Instead, I turned and bolted out of the gas station, leaving the bottle of water on the counter. Back in my car, I slammed the door and locked it, even though the parking lot was deserted. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely grip the wheel. I started the engine, the roar of it breaking the eerie silence, and peeled out of the lot without looking back. The road ahead was empty, stretching into the darkness. The gas station disappeared in my rearview mirror, but the image of that flyer, my face staring back at me, the words "unresolved" beneath it, burned in my mind. Who had made that flyer? How long had it been there? And why did the old man look at me like he knew something I didn't? I drove for hours, aimless and desperate, until exhaustion forced me to stop. The first motel I came across was even worse than the last one, but I didn't care. I needed somewhere to hide, somewhere to think. The clerk at the front desk barely glanced at me as I handed over cash for the room key. The moment I stepped inside, I locked the door, shoved a chair under the handle, and collapsed onto the bed. Sleep didn't come easily, but eventually, exhaustion won. When I woke up, it was still dark, the cheap clock on the nightstand blinking 3:33 a.m. For a moment, I thought maybe things had returned to normal. The room was quiet, the air still. But then I noticed something was wrong. My phone was gone. I was sure I'd left it on the nightstand, but the space was empty. I checked the bed, the floor, my bag. Nothing. Panic bubbled in my chest as I tore the room apart, but it wasn't there. And then, just as I was about to give up, the motel phone rang. The old rotary phone on the desk, covered in dust, let out a shrill, grating ring. My blood ran cold as I stared at it, the sound echoing in the silent room. No one had this number. No one even knew I was here. I didn't want to answer, but the ringing wouldn't stop. Finally, with trembling hands, I picked up the receiver. At first, there was nothing but static. Then a familiar voice came through, faint and layered, like it was coming from far away. "You can't run." My stomach dropped. "Who is this?" I whispered, my voice cracking. The static grew louder, and the voice spoke again, clearer this time. "You were marked for a reason. You weren't supposed to exist, and now you're unresolved." I slammed the receiver down, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The moment it hit the cradle, the lights in the room flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The air grew colder, the same suffocating chill I'd felt in the motel room before. I backed into the corner, clutching the edge of the desk for support, as the shadows in the room began to move. They stretched and twisted, pooling together in the center of the room like ink spreading across paper. And then it appeared. The figure from before, its impossibly long limbs and smooth, featureless face, rose from the shadows. It didn't walk, it flowed, its movements fluid and unnatural, like it was part of the darkness itself. The air around it rippled, distorting the room, and the whispers began again, louder this time. "Why are you doing this to me?" I shouted, my voice echoing in the empty room. "What do you want?" The figure tilted its head, the gesture almost mocking. "We don't want anything," it said, its voice layered and hollow. "We exist to correct mistakes." "I'm not a mistake," I yelled, though the words felt hollow even as I said them. "You are," it said simply. "Your existence defies balance. You were meant to end, and now you are unresolved. The list is not wrong. It never is." The whispers grew louder, the air colder. I felt the weight of its presence pressing down on me, suffocating me. My vision blurred, and I thought I might pass out. Then suddenly the figure stopped, its head tilted again, as if listening to something I couldn't hear. The shadows around it pulsed once, then retreated, pulling back into the corners of the room. The figure's voice was softer now, almost curious. "Someone has interfered." Before I could ask what it meant, the shadows vanished completely. The figure dissolved into the air, leaving the room silent and still. The lights flickered back on, and the chill in the air disappeared. For a moment, I thought it was over. But then I saw the mirror. On the dusty surface of the motel mirror, written in streaks of condensation that hadn't been there before, were 5 words. "This is only the beginning." I left the motel at dawn, the sun casting weak rays of light over the empty parking lot. I didn't know where I was going or what would happen next, but one thing was clear. This wasn't over. Whatever I was marked for, whatever I had stumbled into, it wasn't going to let me go. And now I'm starting to wonder if it ever will. I'm a locksmith. A dark web client paid me to unlock a door in an abandoned house. There was something breathing on the other side. It started like any other day, waking up late, scrolling through my phone, and half-heartedly sipping a coffee that had gone cold an hour ago. Being a locksmith isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills, and people always need someone to save them from their own stupidity. I'd unlocked countless car doors, front doors, and safes for people who either forgot their keys or lost them during one too many tequila shots. But this job was different. I had just finished replacing a lock at an apartment complex when I got a notification on an obscure freelance site I'd signed up for months ago. It was one of those platforms that promised quick cash for odd gigs, most of which were barely legal. The message was short and to the point. Need locksmith. Urgent. $2,000 up front. Additional $2,000 after completion. Discretion required. Address will be sent upon acceptance. $2,000 just to show up? Either this guy was desperate or it was a scam. Probably both. But I wasn't in a position to turn down that kind of money. Rent was overdue, and my van, my only source of income, was one blown tire away from retirement. I replied, trying to sound professional, but also get a feel for what I was getting into. What kind of lock are we talking about? Need to know what tools to bring. The response came almost instantly. Bring everything. That should have been my first red flag. Most people are specific. It's a deadbolt or it's one of those locks with a keypad. But this guy, nothing. Still, $2,000 up front was enough motivation for me to push my doubts aside. I accepted the job, and within seconds, I received the address. It was about 30 miles out of town, deep into an area I'd only ever heard about in local legends. People called it the Bluffs, a stretch of forested hills with no cell service and roads that barely showed up on GPS. If horror movies had an all-you-can-eat buffet of cliches, this place would be the main course. I packed my tools, grabbed the small taser I kept in my glove compartment, and hit the road. The money had already been deposited into my account, so there was no backing out now. As I drove, the city lights faded and the trees closed in around me. The further I went, the worse the roads got. Potholes the size of craters, overgrown branches scraping against my van, and a silence so thick it felt like the world had forgotten this place existed. When I finally reached the address, I almost missed it. The house was hidden behind a wall of trees with no driveway or mailbox in sight. The building itself was a nightmare, 2 stories of rotting wood and shattered windows, with ivy crawling up the sides like nature was trying to reclaim it. A small, rusted gate creaked as I pushed it open, and my headlights barely illuminated the overgrown path leading to the front door. I parked the van, grabbed my gear, and stepped out. The air was heavy, like it was about to rain, but the sky was clear. There was no wind, no sound, just me and the house. The front door was already open, hanging on its hinges like it had been kicked in years ago. I hesitated on the porch, half expecting someone to jump out and yell, "You've been pranked!" But no one did. I stepped inside, and the first thing that hit me was the smell: mold, damp wood, and something metallic, like old blood. The floor creaked with every step, and my flashlight barely cut through the darkness. The house was empty, as far as I could tell, but it didn't feel empty. You know that sensation, like someone standing just behind you, watching? I had that the moment I crossed the threshold. My phone buzzed, startling me. It was a message from the client. "Room at the end of the hallway, locked door." Straight to the point, huh? The hallway was long, lined with peeling wallpaper and doors that led to nowhere. Most of them were ajar, revealing empty rooms filled with broken furniture and debris. But at the very end, there it was, a single door, pristine and out of place, as if someone had installed it yesterday. It was a heavy steel door with no handle, just a keyhole and a faint symbol etched into the metal. The symbol looked ancient, like something you'd see in an Indiana Jones movie. I reached out to touch it, and my hand recoiled. It was ice cold, far colder than anything in the room should have been. I crouched down to examine the lock, but before I could even pull out my tools, I heard it, breathing. At first, I thought it was my own, shallow and shaky from the adrenaline. But as I held my breath, it continued, low and rhythmic, like something huge was on the other side, exhaling in slow, deliberate intervals. The sound wasn't muffled either. It was clear, like whatever was breathing was pressed right up against the door. I froze. My brain scrambled for an explanation. Maybe it was the wind. Maybe some animal had gotten trapped inside. But no, this wasn't natural. The breaths were too measured, too human-like, yet not human at all. My flashlight flickered, and I cursed under my breath. I don't know what possessed me to do it, but I leaned in closer, pressing my ear against the door. That's when I heard it whisper, "Let me out." I stumbled back, my heart hammering in my chest. My first instinct was to run. Screw the money, screw the job, just get out of there. But as I backed away, my phone buzzed again. "Do not leave. Do not speak to it. Just unlock the door." I stared at the message, my mind racing. How did they know? Were they watching me? My flashlight flickered again, plunging the room into darkness for a split second. When the light came back, the air felt heavier, like the room was shrinking around me. The breathing grew louder, faster, almost impatient. And then I made the mistake of speaking. I don't know why I said anything. Maybe it was the pressure, the suffocating silence, the feeling of being watched, or just the sheer wrongness of the situation. My brain wasn't exactly firing on all cylinders, but as I stood there staring at that cursed door, the words just slipped out. "Who's there?" The breathing stopped. Dead silence. Not even the faint creak of the old house dared to interrupt it. My heart pounded so hard I thought it might explode. I stood frozen, my flashlight trembling in my hand, the beam darting across the steel door as if looking for some kind of logical explanation. Then, softly at first, I heard it. Tap, tap, tap. Something was tapping from the other side, slow and deliberate, like it wanted me to know it was still there. My breath caught in my throat as I took a step back, my boots crunching against the broken tiles of the floor. The tapping grew louder, heavier, until it sounded like a fist pounding against the metal. And then it stopped. "Let me out." The voice was different this time. It wasn't a whisper anymore. It was deeper, resonant, like it wasn't coming from behind the door, but from everywhere at once. It vibrated through the floor, the walls, and straight into my chest. I stumbled back, barely catching myself on a shattered table. I didn't respond this time. I wasn't that stupid. But I didn't have to. The thing, whatever it was, seemed to sense my hesitation. "You have the tools. Unlock the door. It's what you're here for." I don't know how long I stood there staring at that door. My brain was screaming at me to leave, to run, to drive as far away as I could and never look back. But my body wouldn't move. It was like the air around me had thickened, trapping me in place. My phone buzzed again, snapping me out of it. The message from the client was short, almost impatient. "Do your job." My hands were shaking so badly it took me 3 tries to pull the lockpick from my tool belt. I crouched down, forcing myself to focus on the task at hand. The lock was old, its mechanisms unfamiliar, but I'd dealt with worse. At least, that's what I told myself. As I worked, the air around me grew colder. My breath came out in visible puffs, and my fingers started to numb. The deeper my pick went into the lock, the louder the sound on the other side became. It wasn't breathing anymore, it was scratching. Nails or claws, dragging against the steel, desperate and frantic. And then, just as I felt the lock click into place, it spoke again. Finally. The noise upstairs. The lock was open, but I didn't move. Every instinct I had was telling me not to turn the handle, not to find out what was waiting on the other side. My flashlight flickered again, and in the brief darkness, I heard it. Heavy footsteps coming from upstairs. I whipped my light around, shining it toward the staircase at the far end of the hall. The beam caught nothing but dust and shadows, but the sound continued. Slow, deliberate thuds, like someone, or something, was walking across the second floor. The boards creaked under its weight, groaning with each step. I stood up slowly, my back to the steel door. My brain was at full capacity now, trying to figure out how to get out of this alive. There was no way I was sticking around to find out what was upstairs, or behind that door. I started backing toward the front of the house, but before I could take 3 steps, my phone buzzed again. "Do not leave." That's when I saw it. A shadow, long and thin, stretched across the floor at the end of the hallway. It wasn't mine. It moved unnaturally, shifting and bending as though it was alive. My flashlight flickered again, and for a split second, I saw it, a figure just standing there. It wasn't a person. It was too tall, its limbs too long, its head tilted at an unnatural angle. I froze, my flashlight locked on the shadow as it began to move toward me. The air grew heavier with every step it took, and I could hear it now, those same deliberate thuds from upstairs, only closer. It stopped a few feet away, just outside the reach of my light. I couldn't see its face, if it even had one, but I could feel it staring at me. My skin crawled and my chest felt like it was caving in. I wanted to run, to scream, to do anything, but my legs wouldn't move. That's when the door behind me began to creak. The steel door was opening, slowly, painfully, as though whatever was on the other side was struggling to push it. The scraping sound of metal against metal filled the hallway, and the air became suffocatingly cold. I could feel something behind me, something massive and alive, stepping closer with each agonizing second. I made my decision in that moment. I dropped my tools, turned, and bolted toward the front door. My flashlight swung wildly in my hand, casting chaotic shadows across the walls. The sound of the steel door swinging open echoed behind me, followed by a low, guttural growl that shook the entire house. I didn't look back. As I burst out onto the porch, the air outside hit me like a slap in the face, warm, humid, and free of the suffocating pressure from inside. I didn't stop running until I reached my van, fumbling with the keys before throwing myself inside and slamming the door shut. As I sped down the overgrown road, I glanced in the rearview mirror. The house was still there, dark and silent, but something was standing on the porch. Tall and thin, its head tilted at that unnatural angle, watching me as I disappeared into the night. I drove for what felt like hours, gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. The forest around me was pitch black, my headlights barely cutting through the suffocating darkness. My heart was still racing, my mind replaying everything that had happened back in that cursed house. The breathing, the whispers, the shadow in the hallway. It didn't make sense. None of it did. But the worst part? The feeling that I hadn't really escaped. The road ahead was winding, and every sharp turn made me glance in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing sitting in the back seat. My van's engine groaned as it struggled up a hill, the tires slipping on the gravel road. When I finally reached the top, my phone buzzed again. I nearly swerved off the road. For a moment, I debated not looking at it. Whatever the client wanted, I was done. No amount of money was worth this. But curiosity, or maybe stupidity, got the better of me. I grabbed the phone with one hand, my eyes darting between the screen and the road. "Why did you run?" I felt my stomach drop. How? How could they know? I hadn't seen anyone around the house. No cameras, no drones, nothing. My hands started shaking again as another message came through. "You didn't finish the job." I slammed on the brakes, my van skidding to a stop on the deserted road. My breath came in short, shallow gasps as I stared at the message. Before I could even think of a response, the phone buzzed again. "Turn around. Now." I don't know why, but I looked back. The road behind me was empty, swallowed by darkness. For a moment I considered driving off and ditching my phone entirely, but as I pressed the gas, the engine sputtered, coughed, and died. "Number no, no, no," I muttered, twisting the key in the ignition. Nothing, not even a click. It was as if the van had simply given up, leaving me stranded in the middle of nowhere. I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside, the night air thick and oppressive. The forest was eerily quiet, not a single rustle of leaves, no chirping insects, nothing. Just the sound of my boots crunching on the gravel as I opened the hood and peered inside. Everything looked fine, at least as fine as an engine can look to someone who barely knows how to change their oil. I jiggled a few wires, praying for a miracle, but when I tried the ignition again, it was the same story. Dead. And that's when I heard it. Footsteps. The stranger. They were faint at first, coming from the direction of the house, steady, deliberate, and getting closer. I turned off my flashlight and crouched behind the van, my heart pounding in my chest. Whoever, or whatever it was, they weren't in a hurry. The footsteps echoed in the stillness, each one sending a jolt of fear through me. Peering around the side of the van, I caught a glimpse of a figure emerging from the shadows. It wasn't the same thing I'd seen in the hallway. This was a man, or at least it looked like one. He was tall and thin, dressed in a tattered coat that hung loosely from his bony frame. His head was tilted, just like the thing on the porch, and his movements were stiff, almost puppet-like. He stopped a few feet from the van, his back to me, and just stood there. Not moving, not breathing, just standing. I held my breath, pressing myself against the van's cold metal, hoping he wouldn't notice me. And then, without turning around, he spoke. "You shouldn't have run." His voice was flat, emotionless, like it didn't belong to a living person. I wanted to scream, to jump in the van and lock the doors, but my body refused to move. He took a step closer, his head tilting even further, like he was trying to listen for something. It doesn't like to be left behind. Before I could react, the man turned and looked directly at me. His eyes, if you could even call them that, were hollow, empty sockets that seemed to drink in the light. His mouth twisted into a grotesque grin, revealing jagged, blackened teeth. I scrambled back, falling to the ground as he began to walk toward me. My flashlight slipped from my hand and rolled into the darkness, leaving me in near total blackness. I fumbled for it, my fingers shaking, but before I could grab it, I felt his hand on my arm. It was ice cold, the grip impossibly strong. My skin burned where he touched me, a searing pain that spread up my arm like fire. I screamed, kicking and thrashing, but he didn't let go. "It marked you," he said, his grin widening. "You're part of it now." I don't know how I managed it, but I kicked him square in the chest. His grip loosened just enough for me to break free, and I bolted into the woods. Branches tore at my clothes and face as I ran, the sound of his laughter echoing behind me. The forest was endless, a labyrinth of twisted trees and uneven ground. No matter how far I ran, the laughter followed me, growing louder and more distorted. My lungs burned, and my legs felt like they were about to give out, but I couldn't stop. Just when I thought I couldn't run any further, I saw it, a faint light in the distance. It wasn't my van, and it definitely wasn't the house. It was something else entirely. Desperate and out of options, I sprinted toward it, hoping it was some kind of safe haven. As I got closer, the light began to take shape. It was a lantern hanging from a crooked tree. Beneath it was a small, rusted sign with a single word scrawled in faded paint. "Stay." I skidded to a stop, my instincts screaming at me to turn back. But before I could, I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. The breath on my neck froze me in place. It wasn't like a normal exhale, it was wrong, like a draft coming from a tomb. I didn't dare turn around. My chest heaved with shallow breaths, and my legs felt like jelly. The lantern above me flickered, casting long, jittery shadows that seemed to move on their own. The sign beneath the lantern swayed gently in the breeze, or maybe it wasn't the breeze. My eyes locked on the faded word painted there. Stay. My gut screamed at me to obey. My van was dead, the road was a distant memory, and the woods were alive with something I couldn't comprehend. Running had gotten me nowhere, and now I was stranded in the middle of this nightmare. But then I heard the footsteps again, slow, deliberate, and much closer than before. I clenched my fists, summoning whatever courage I had left, and finally turned around. There was nothing there, no man, no shadow, no twisted figure looming in the dark, just the trees, gnarled and ancient, their bark cracking like aged skin. but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that it was waiting. My flashlight was still gone, and the pale light from the lantern barely stretched a few feet. Beyond that, the forest was an impenetrable void. Every nerve in my body told me to stay in the light, to stay beneath the lantern's protective glow. But then in the distance, I saw them. Eyes, hundreds of them, glowing faintly in the darkness. They weren't human, too big, too round, and too far apart. They blinked in unison, their pale glow shifting as though they were all focused on me. My breath hitched as I stumbled back toward the lantern, my back pressing against the crooked tree. One by one, the eyes began to move forward, their light growing stronger as the creatures emerged from the shadows. They weren't walking, they were crawling, dragging themselves across the forest floor with long, skeletal limbs. Their bodies were impossibly thin, their spines bent at unnatural angles, and their skin shimmered like wet stone. And then they spoke, not in words, but in sound, a low, guttural hum that vibrated through the air, building in intensity until it became a deafening roar. I clamped my hands over my ears, sinking to my knees as the creatures closed in. My arm burned again, the same searing pain I'd felt when the man in the coat grabbed me. I pulled up my sleeve, and my stomach turned. A symbol was etched into my skin, faint but unmistakable. It was the same one that had been carved into the steel door back at the house. The mark pulsed, glowing faintly, and as it did, the creatures stopped. Their eyes flickered, and the hum in the air wavered like a radio signal cutting in and out. For a moment, they seemed uncertain, as if the mark on my arm had disrupted whatever was driving them forward. I didn't wait to find out why. I scrambled to my feet and bolted back into the woods, the lantern's light disappearing behind me. The creatures didn't follow, but the forest itself seemed to shift as I ran. The trees leaned closer together, their branches twisting into claw-like shapes that tore at my clothes and skin. The ground became uneven, tripping me up with every step. And then I saw it, a clearing up ahead, a faint, flickering light that wasn't from the lantern. I pushed through the last tangle of branches and stumbled into the open, gasping for air. The clearing was small, surrounded by a perfect ring of trees that looked different from the ones I'd just run through. Their bark was smooth, almost polished, and their branches formed an unbroken canopy above, blocking out the stars. In the center of the clearing was a circle of stones, arranged in a way that was too precise to be natural. At its heart was a small, crackling fire, and standing beside it was the man. He was waiting for me, his tall, thin frame silhouetted against the firelight. His head was still tilted, his hollow eyes locked on mine. He didn't move as I approached, my legs carrying me forward despite every instinct screaming at me to stop. "You shouldn't have come back," he said, his voice low and mechanical. "I didn't have a choice," I shot back, surprising myself with the strength in my voice. "You sent me here. You're the one who—" He raised a hand, and I felt my words die in my throat. His grin widened, revealing those jagged teeth again. "It's not about what I want," he said. "It's about what it wants." He gestured to the fire, and for the first time I noticed something moving within the flames, a shadow, twisting and writhing, its form impossible to pin down. It didn't look human or even animal. It was wrong in every sense of the word. My mark began to burn again, brighter and hotter than before. "You're marked now," the man continued. "You opened the door, you let it out, and now it wants you." I stumbled back, shaking my head. No, I didn't open the door, I didn't—" "But you unlocked it," he interrupted. "That's all it needed." The shadow in the fire grew larger, its shape pressing against the edges of the flame as if trying to escape. The man stepped closer, his empty eyes boring into mine. "You can't outrun it," he said. "You can't fight it. But maybe you can make a deal." My heart was pounding so loudly I could barely hear him. "What kind of deal?" He grinned again, and for the first time I saw something resembling emotion in his expression. Glee, mixed with malice. "You give it what it wants," he said, "and maybe it lets you go." The shadow in the fire pulsed, its form almost solid now. The air grew heavier, thicker, as the ground beneath my feet began to tremble. I didn't have time to ask what it wanted, because deep down I already knew. The ground beneath me quaked, and the fire swelled, casting flickering shadows across the clearing. The figure inside the flames twisted violently as if struggling to break free. I couldn't take my eyes off it. My mark throbbed with a heat so intense it felt like my skin was about to peel away. "What does it want?" I asked, my voice trembling. The man's grin widened, and he tilted his head even farther, an unnatural angle that made my stomach churn. "You," he said simply. "But it's not as simple as surrender. It wants you to choose." The flames roared louder, and for a moment I thought I saw faces in them. Distorted, screaming faces that flickered in and out of existence. The shadow moved again, and this time it whispered something I couldn't understand. It wasn't in any language I'd ever heard, but the sound of it made my head spin and my vision blur. "What choice?" I asked, stumbling back. The man gestured to the fire, his hollow eyes glinting in the light. "It needs a replacement, a soul to keep it tethered. If you don't choose, it will take yours." I felt the air leave my lungs. My mind raced, trying to make sense of what he was saying. A replacement? A soul? None of this was real, it couldn't be. But the burning on my arm, the twisted shadow in the flames, the creatures in the woods, it was all too vivid, too tangible to dismiss. The man stepped closer, his skeletal frame towering over me. "Think carefully," he said. "The wrong choice and you'll wish it had taken you instead." The fire dimmed slightly, and for a moment, everything was still. Then from the flames, the shadow spoke. "Bring me another." The words were low, guttural, and felt like they were being spoken directly into my mind. My mark burned brighter, and the air around me grew colder. I understood now. It wanted me to deliver someone else in my place, to trap another soul so I could go free. The man watched me, his grin never faltering. The woods are full of wanderers, lost souls looking for something. Bring it one of them, and you walk away. I shook my head, my thoughts spiraling. I can't do that. I can't just hand someone over. The man's grin faltered for the first time, replaced by something that almost looked like pity. "Then it will take you," he said, "and it will make you one of them." I thought of the creatures in the woods, the way they crawled, the way their eyes glowed with an unnatural light. Was that what he meant? Was that what I'd become? The shadow in the fire shifted again, its form expanding until it seemed to tower over the clearing. The faces in the flames screamed louder, their distorted mouths stretching impossibly wide. The pressure in the air became unbearable, and I dropped to my knees. "Choose," the shadow hissed. I thought about running again, but deep down, I knew there was no escape. The woods would trap me, the van wouldn't start, and the creatures would drag me back here if I tried. There was no way out, not unless I gave it what it wanted. But how could I? How could I condemn someone else to this nightmare? The man crouched down beside me, his empty eyes inches from my face. "It doesn't care who you bring," he said softly. "A stranger. Someone you've never met. You'll never have to see them again. His words were like poison, sinking into my mind. I wanted to believe I wasn't capable of something so monstrous, but the longer I sat there, the more the fire seemed to pull at me, whispering promises of escape, promises of freedom. And then I remembered something the man had said earlier. You're part of it now. If I left, even if I survived, I would still be marked. It would follow me, haunt me, until it finally took me. There was no freedom, not really. Unless... I looked at the man, his hollow grin returning, as if he knew what I was thinking. I stood slowly, my legs shaky but resolute. The shadow in the fire twisted, its form growing restless, impatient. I'll bring you someone, I said, my voice steady despite the storm of fear inside me. The man tilted his head again, his grin widening. Good choice, he said. But he didn't notice the small, sharp rock I'd picked up from the ground. Before he could react, I lunged forward, driving the rock into his chest. His grin twisted into a grimace of surprise as he stumbled back toward the fire. I didn't stop. I shoved him with every ounce of strength I had, sending him sprawling into the flames. The fire roared, the shadow within it writhing violently. The man's screams filled the clearing as the flames consumed him, his skeletal frame convulsing as he was pulled into the shadow's embrace. The ground shook, the trees trembled, and for a moment I thought the whole forest was going to collapse. Then silence. The fire died out, leaving only the circle of stones and the faint glow of my mark. I stared at the empty space where the man had been, my mind struggling to process what I'd just done. I don't remember leaving the clearing. The next thing I knew, I was standing by my van, the engine purring softly as if nothing had ever been wrong. The forest was still, the oppressive air lifted, and the shadow was gone. But the mark remained. It doesn't burn anymore, but I can feel it. A faint hum under my skin, a reminder of the deal I made. I don't know if it worked, if the shadow is truly gone, or if I've just delayed the inevitable. Sometimes, in the dead of night, I hear whispers, faint and distant, but unmistakable. And every now and then, when I pass a mirror, I catch a glimpse of something behind me, watching, waiting. I was hired to catalogue items from an abandoned warehouse. The dark web says the warehouse is a front for disappeared people. You know how sometimes you're scrolling through job listings and you stumble on one that seems way too good to be true? That's exactly how I felt when I saw the ad. Seeking assistant to catalogue items in an abandoned warehouse. $50 per hour, flexible schedule, immediate start. $50 an hour to write down some inventory. I thought it was a scam at first, but I clicked on the link anyway. The description was vague, something about documenting unclaimed property and basic data entry. I figured, worst case, I'd waste an afternoon, or best case, I'd actually land a gig that could pay my rent for the month. I sent in my application and heard back the same day. The email was short and formal. Thank you for your interest. Please meet at location redacted at 10 a.m. tomorrow. Bring a notebook and wear comfortable clothes. There was no company name, no phone number, just GPS coordinates. That should have been a red flag, right? But I was broke, desperate, and honestly a little curious. The warehouse was in the middle of nowhere, about 45 minutes outside of town. When I got there, I had to double-check the address because it didn't look like anyone had been there in years. The building was huge, easily the size of a Costco, with faded grey walls and rust streaks running down the sides. A white van was parked out front. A guy in his mid-40s stepped out as I pulled up. He had that look like he didn't care much about appearances, faded jeans, a stained jacket, and a baseball cap pulled low over his face. "You're the new hire?" he asked. His voice was gruff, like he smoked a pack a day. Yeah, I said, suddenly feeling way less confident. He didn't bother introducing himself. We'll start with the smaller rooms. Just write down what you see. Items, labels, any serial numbers. Don't touch anything unless I say so. Inside, the warehouse was worse than I imagined. The air was stale, like wet cardboard and something faintly metallic. The lights flickered overhead, and most of the place was still in shadows. The first room he led me to was lined with shelves that stretched to the ceiling. At first glance, it looked like any other storage space, boxes, crates, and random junk everywhere. But as I started cataloguing, things got weird. One box was filled with old VHS tapes, all unmarked except for numbers written in black Sharpie. Another crate had a pile of rusty handcuffs like the kind you'd see in an old police station. There were dozens of mismatched shoes in another bin, all worn down like they'd been pulled off people who'd walked miles in them. I couldn't help but ask, "What is all this stuff?" The guy just shrugged. "Unclaimed goods, doesn't matter, just write it down." I wanted to press further, but something about his tone told me not to. After a couple of hours, I started noticing a pattern. Most of the items seemed personal. There were wallets, keys, and even old photo albums. One box was stuffed with loose Polaroid pictures, most of them too blurry or dark to make out, but some were of people. Random people. Strangers, smiling at the camera, like they didn't know it was the last picture they'd ever take. "Hey, is this legal?" I asked, half joking, half serious. He stopped what he was doing and gave me this look, like he was trying to decide if I was worth answering. "Just keep working," he said finally. By lunchtime, I was feeling uneasy. The place was giving me major bad vibes, but I told myself I was overthinking it. $50 an hour wasn't bad for writing stuff down, even if the job was a little creepy. But then we reached the far end of the warehouse. This part of the building was darker, and the shelves were mostly empty. The guy handed me a flashlight and told me to follow him. I wanted to ask why we couldn't just stick to the well-lit areas, but I kept my mouth shut. At the back of the room, there was a door with a padlock. He pulled out a key, unlocked it, and pushed it open. The room inside was smaller, more like a storage closet, but it was packed with boxes stacked to the ceiling. He handed me a notebook. "Start here. Work your way left to right." The first box I opened made my stomach drop. Inside was a stack of folders, each labelled with a name and a date. The names didn't mean anything to me, but the dates were all from the past few years. I opened one of the folders, and my hands started shaking. It was filled with documents, driver's licenses, birth certificates, even medical records. The name on the folder matched the name on the ID. "Hey, I started, but the guy cut me off. "Don't ask questions," he said, his voice sharp. "Just do the job." I tried to focus on the work, but the deeper I got, the worse it got. Another box had even more Polaroids, only these ones weren't blurry. They were sharp and clear, showing people in various places, parks, houses, busy streets. All of them looked normal except for the fact that every single one of them had the same blank, almost dead expression. In the next box I found bundles of clothing, shirts, pants and jackets neatly folded, like they'd been taken straight off someone and packed away. Most of them were stained, but not with dirt. By the time I finished that room, I was done. My head was spinning, and I could feel the sweat pooling under my shirt. I wanted to leave, but I didn't know how to quit without making things worse. When I got back to my car, I Googled the address, hoping to find some explanation for what I'd just seen. Instead, I found something worse. One of the first results was a post on some obscure forum. Someone had uploaded photos of the warehouse, photos that matched exactly what I'd seen. The caption read, This place is a front. Everyone who works there disappears eventually. My stomach turned as I read the comments. People were speculating that the warehouse was tied to the deep web, some kind of black market operation for human trafficking or worse. I tried telling myself it was just conspiracy theory nonsense, but when I looked up from my phone, I noticed something strange. The white van wasn't in the parking lot anymore, but there was a new car sitting a few spaces away. And there was someone inside, watching me. I froze, gripping my steering wheel so hard my knuckles turned white. The car parked a few spaces away was dark, a black sedan with tinted windows. It was just sitting there, engine running. I told myself it was probably nothing. Maybe someone just pulled in to eat lunch, or maybe they were lost. But deep down, I didn't believe that for a second. The person in the car wasn't moving. They were watching me. I couldn't see their face through the tinted glass, but I felt their gaze, like a weight pressing down on my chest. I turned the key in the ignition, trying to act casual, but my hands were shaking so bad I could barely grip it. The engine roared to life, and for a split second I thought that was the end of it. Until the sedan's headlights blinked on. I pulled out of the parking lot, doing my best to keep my eyes on the road and not the rearview mirror. But I couldn't help glancing back every few seconds. The black sedan pulled out right after me. It wasn't close, just far enough to keep me in sight. But it didn't matter. I knew they were following me. I didn't go straight home. I wasn't about to lead them to my apartment. Instead, I drove aimlessly, weaving through random streets and taking turns at the last second, hoping to lose them. But no matter where I went, they stayed right behind me. I even tried pulling into a gas station to see if they'd keep going, but they just parked across the street, waiting. After an hour of aimless driving, I finally decided to head to a crowded shopping plaza. I figured if anything happened, at least I wouldn't be alone. The sedan followed me into the parking lot, but this time it didn't stop. It drove past me, disappearing into the maze of cars. For a moment, I thought I was in the clear. I sat there in my car, staring at the spot where the sedan vanished, trying to make sense of what had just happened. But then I noticed something else. A man, dressed in dark clothes, was walking toward me. He wasn't running. He wasn't rushing. He was just walking, calm and steady, like he had all the time in the world. I couldn't see his face. He was wearing a baseball cap pulled low, just like the guy at the warehouse. My gut told me it wasn't the same person, but that didn't make me feel any better. I locked my doors and tried to act like I didn't see him, hoping he'd just walk past, but he didn't. He stopped right next to my car, standing so close I couldn't see him unless I turned my head. I didn't want to turn my head. I held my breath, waiting for him to do something, knock on the window, try the door handle, something. But he just stood there, and then he did the one thing I didn't expect. He leaned down, his face right next to the glass, and whispered something. I couldn't hear what he said, not through the window, but I saw his lips move. And then he was gone. I didn't wait to see where he went. I peeled out of the parking lot, tires screeching, and drove straight to the police station. I felt ridiculous explaining what had happened. How do you tell someone you think you're being followed by... What? A random car? A guy whispering things you couldn't even hear? The officer at the desk listened patiently, but I could tell he didn't take me seriously. He asked if I got the license plate number of the sedan. Of course I hadn't. He asked if the man threatened me. Technically, no. You probably just got spooked, he said, handing me a card with the non-emergency number. Call us if you see anything else. I nodded, thanked him, and left, even though I knew they weren't going to help. When I finally got home, I locked every door and window and checked the security cameras I'd installed last year after a string of break-ins in my neighborhood. The feeds were clear. No black sedan, no strange man. For the first time all day, I started to feel like maybe I was overreacting. Then my phone buzzed. It was a text. "You shouldn't have opened that last box." My heart stopped. I didn't recognize the number, but the message was clear. Someone knew what I'd done. I tried calling the number, but it went straight to voicemail. I left the phone on the table and paced around my apartment, trying to figure out what to do. Maybe it was a prank. Maybe it was the guy from the warehouse trying to scare me. Or maybe it was something worse. I checked the security camera feeds again, hoping to distract myself. But this time, the screens weren't clear. On one of the cameras, there was a man standing in my driveway, staring straight into the lens. He was holding something in his hand, a Polaroid camera, and he was smiling. My first instinct was to turn off the screen. If I couldn't see him, maybe he wasn't really there. But I forced myself to keep watching, my heart pounding in my chest. The man with the Polaroid camera didn't move. He just stood there, smiling, like he was waiting for me to notice him. Then in one quick motion, he raised the camera, aimed it at the security lens and clicked. The flash lit up the entire driveway. A second later, the camera spit out a photo, and the man held it up, waving it in the air like he wanted me to see. That was enough. I grabbed my phone and called the police, stumbling over my words as I tried to explain what was happening. "There's a man outside my house," I said, struggling to keep my voice steady. "He has a camera. He's taking pictures of my house." The dispatcher asked me a million questions. Did I know the man? Was he armed? Was he trying to break in? I could barely answer. My eyes were glued to the screen, watching as the man walked closer to my front door. "I'll send a unit," the dispatcher said, but her voice was calm, like she didn't understand how serious this was. By the time I hung up, the man was gone. 1 second he was standing in the driveway, and the next he just wasn't. I replayed the footage, thinking maybe I'd missed something, but the video didn't show him walking away. It was like he'd vanished into thin air. I double-checked the locks on every door and window and grabbed the heaviest thing I could find, a baseball bat I kept under the bed. I felt ridiculous holding it, but it was better than nothing. The cops showed up about 20 minutes later, 2 officers in a squad car, looking just as unimpressed as the guy at the station earlier. I showed them the security footage, but they didn't seem convinced. "Could have been a neighbor messing around," one of them said, shrugging. "Or maybe someone casing the place." "What about the photo he took?" I asked. The officers exchanged a look. "What photo?" I led them outside to the driveway, half expecting it to be gone, but the Polaroid was there, lying face down on the concrete. One of the officers picked it up with gloved hands, flipping it over to reveal the picture. It was my front door, the same view from the security camera. But there was something off about it. In the photo, the door was wide open. Both officers looked at me, waiting for an explanation. "I never opened the door," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. They didn't seem convinced. "Do you have a roommate? Family? Anyone who could have opened it without you noticing?" "No," I snapped. "It's just me." The officers took the photo as evidence, but they didn't stick around long. "We'll increase patrols in the area," one of them said, before they left. "Call us if anything else happens." Great. That was helpful. That night I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing things, little noises like footsteps, doors creaking, whispers that I couldn't quite make out. Every time I checked the cameras, they were clear, but that didn't make me feel any better. Around 3 a.m., I finally gave up and went to the kitchen for some water. That's when I saw it. Another Polaroid. This one was on the floor just inside the front door. My hands were shaking as I picked it up. The photo was of my living room, taken from somewhere inside the house. In the picture, I was sitting on the couch, staring at my phone. I dropped the photo and bolted back to my bedroom, slamming the door shut and shoving a chair under the knob. My mind was racing. Someone had been in my house. Someone was still in my house. I called the cops again, my voice barely steady enough to get the words out. "There's someone in my house," I said. "They've been taking pictures of me." This time, they didn't waste any time. Within minutes, I heard sirens outside, and the red and blue lights flashed through my bedroom window. The officers swept the house from top to bottom, but they didn't find anyone. "What about the photo?" I asked, shoving it into their hands. One of them frowned as he studied it. "Where did you find this?" "On the floor," I said. "By the front door." The officer exchanged a look with his partner. "You're sure this is you?" "What kind of question is that? Of course it's me." The officer didn't say anything. He just handed the photo back to me and left. I stared at the picture for what felt like hours, trying to figure out what was wrong with it. The more I looked, the more I realized it wasn't just my living room. It was my living room exactly as it looked right now. Same furniture, same half-empty glass of water on the coffee table, same baseball bat leaning against the couch. But in the photo, there was something else. Someone was standing behind me. I didn't wait for the cops to come back. I grabbed my keys, got in my car, and drove as far away as I could. I didn't have a destination. I just needed to get out of that house. It wasn't until I stopped at a gas station hours later that I noticed something else. Tucked under my windshield wiper was another Polaroid. This one was of me, sitting in my car, holding the photo I'd just found. The caption scrawled across the bottom read, "Don't leave, we're not done yet." I didn't sleep that night. I couldn't. I stayed parked in a motel lot on the edge of town, gripping the baseball bat and jumping at every shadow that moved. The Polaroid on my windshield had been the final straw. Someone wasn't just following me, they were toying with me, letting me know they could get close whenever they wanted. And what scared me most was that I had no idea how many of them there were or what they wanted. As the sun came up, I made a decision. I had to go back to the warehouse. It sounds stupid now, but I needed answers. The pictures, the strange man with the camera, the job itself, it all started there. If I could figure out what was really going on, maybe I could make it stop. I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the way to the warehouse, taking a long route to make sure no one was following me. The building looked even more lifeless in the daylight, like the whole place had been forgotten. The van wasn't in the lot anymore, but the padlock on the front door was hanging open. I wasn't sure if that was a good sign or a very bad one. Inside, the warehouse was just as I remembered it, cold, dimly lit, and completely silent. But something felt off. The air smelled different, sharper, like chemicals or metal, and the boxes I'd been cataloguing the day before were gone. All of them. The shelves were completely empty, as if they'd been wiped clean overnight. I wandered through the aisles, my footsteps echoing in the cavernous space. Every so often I'd see something out of place, an empty coffee cup on the floor, a pile of cigarette butts near a shelf, but no sign of the guy who hired me or anyone else. That's when I noticed the sound. It was faint at first, like a low hum, coming from somewhere deep in the warehouse. I followed it, weaving through the shelves and stepping over stray pieces of junk. The sound grew louder as I went, mechanical, rhythmic, like the whirring of a machine. And then I saw it. At the back of the warehouse, where the shelves gave way to open space, there was a door. It was metal, rusted, and slightly ajar. The sound was coming from behind it. I hesitated, my hand hovering over the handle. Every instinct in my body screamed at me to leave, but my curiosity wouldn't let me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was completely different from the rest of the warehouse. It wasn't dusty or abandoned. It was clean, almost sterile, like a laboratory. The walls were lined with metal cabinets and computer monitors, most of which were dark. In the center of the room was a large table covered in papers, photos, and folders, all spread out like someone had been working there recently. But what caught my attention was the row of screens on the far wall. They were all turned on, displaying security camera feeds from different locations. Some were from inside the warehouse, but others showed places I didn't recognize: parking lots, busy streets, even the inside of what looked like someone's house. And then I saw it. One of the screens was showing a live feed of the motel parking lot. My car was still there, parked exactly where I'd left it. I felt my stomach drop. Whoever was doing this, they weren't just following me, they were tracking me, watching my every move. I stepped closer to the table, scanning the papers for anything that might explain what was going on. Most of it was gibberish, numbers, dates, and diagrams I didn't understand. But one of the folders caught my eye. It had my name on it. My hands trembled as I opened it. Inside were copies of my driver's license, medical records, even photos of me from years ago. Some of the pictures were from places I didn't even recognize, like someone had been following me long before I started this job. The last page in the folder was a handwritten note. Subject identified. Awaiting final instructions. I didn't get a chance to read it twice. The hum that had filled the room suddenly cut out, leaving an eerie silence in its place. And then the door slammed shut. I spun around, heart racing, and saw the man with the Polaroid camera standing in the doorway. This time, he wasn't smiling. He took a step toward me, raising the camera like he was about to take another picture. I backed away, knocking over a stack of papers, but there was nowhere to go. The camera flashed, blinding me for a moment. When my vision cleared, the man was gone. But the photo was already developing, lying on the floor where he'd been standing. I picked it up, my hands shaking so badly I almost dropped it. The picture showed the room I was standing in, but there was something different about it. In the photo, I wasn't alone. There were at least a dozen people in the room, all standing perfectly still, their faces hidden in the shadows. And they were all looking at me. The sound of footsteps echoed down the hallway outside, getting closer. I didn't wait to find out who or what they belonged to. I grabbed the folder with my name on it, stuffed it into my jacket, and ran. By the time I reached the parking lot, my legs felt like jelly, but I didn't stop. I jumped into my car, started the engine, and floored it out of there, not even bothering to look in the rear-view mirror. I didn't stop driving until I was miles away, back in the city, surrounded by people and traffic. For the first time in hours, I felt like I could breathe. But when I reached into my pocket to pull out the folder, it wasn't there. Instead, there was another Polaroid. This one showed me sitting in my car, staring at the camera. And scrawled across the bottom, in shaky handwriting, were the words, "You can't run forever." For a long time, I just sat there in my car, staring at the Polaroid. My face in the picture wasn't scared or panicked like I felt now. It was calm, too calm, like it wasn't me at all. The handwriting at the bottom sent a chill through me. You can't run forever. It was true. Running hadn't worked. The Polaroids, the man, the tracking. They'd been one step ahead of me the entire time. The only option left was to face whatever this was, even if it killed me. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to figure out what to do. The warehouse was out of the question, and the police clearly didn't believe me. That's when it hit me. The deep web. The forum I'd found before, the one with the photos of the warehouse and people saying it was a front, might have answers. I found a public Wi-Fi connection at a 24-hour diner, parked in the back, and logged in on my laptop. My hands shook as I pulled up the site again, scrolling through thread after thread. Most of it was the usual conspiracy nonsense, but then I found a post buried near the bottom. If you've worked there, you need to read this. The post was long, written like a warning from someone who knew exactly what I was going through. They talked about the warehouse being a front for something bigger, something connected to disappearances, human experiments, and a shadowy group that operated beyond the law. But one line stood out to me. If they've started sending you Polaroids, it means you're marked. They're not watching you. They're testing you. Testing me for what? The post had a link at the bottom leading to a hidden chat room. Against my better judgment, I clicked it. A single message popped up immediately. What did you take? I hesitated before typing back. Nothing. I didn't take anything. The response came almost instantly. Then why are they after you? I stared at the screen, my pulse racing. I didn't know how to answer. I thought about the boxes, the photos, the folder with my name on it. Maybe I hadn't physically taken anything, but I'd seen too much. I started typing, but before I could hit send, another message appeared. They're already here. My heart stopped. I looked out the windows of my car, scanning the dark lot for any sign of movement. At first, I didn't see anything, but then I noticed the silhouette. A figure standing perfectly still at the edge of the lot, just outside the glow of the streetlights. They weren't alone. One by one, more figures appeared, stepping out of the shadows like they'd been waiting for this moment. I counted 6, then 8, then 10. All of them were dressed in dark clothes, their faces hidden by hoods or shadows, and every single one of them was holding a Polaroid camera. The first flash lit up the lot, followed by another, then another, until it felt like I was caught in a lightning storm. I didn't wait to see what they were doing. I threw the car into reverse, tires screeching as I backed out of the lot. But as I turned onto the road, I saw something that made my stomach drop. A Polaroid was taped to the inside of my windshield, directly in front of me. It wasn't there before. I ripped it down, my hands trembling, as I stared at the image. It was my car, parked exactly where it had been in the lot. But this time, the photo showed me slumped over the wheel, my eyes closed. And there was blood. I slammed on the brakes, my mind racing. Was this a warning, a threat, or something worse, something inevitable? I didn't have time to think about it. The black sedan from before was in my rear-view mirror, its headlights glowing like eyes. It was getting closer, closing the distance with every second. I floored it, taking random turns and speeding down empty streets, but no matter where I went, the sedan stayed right behind me. It was like they wanted me to keep running. Eventually I found myself on a narrow road that led out of town, surrounded by nothing but trees and darkness. I should have turned back, but something told me this was exactly where I needed to go. The road ended at a clearing, and in the middle of it was the warehouse. It didn't make sense. I'd driven miles away from it, but here it was, waiting for me like it had always been there. The sedan stopped behind me, its headlights cutting through the dark. I didn't see anyone get out, but I knew they were watching. The door to the warehouse was open, light spilling out into the clearing. And taped to the door was another Polaroid. This one showed the inside of the warehouse, but it was different from before. The shelves were gone, replaced by a single chair in the center of the room. And sitting in the chair was me. I don't know why I got out of the car. Maybe I wanted answers. Maybe I just wanted it to end. The air inside the warehouse was colder than I remembered. and the light flickered overhead, casting long, eerie shadows. The chair was there, just like in the photo. And sitting on the seat was the Polaroid camera. I picked it up, my hands trembling. There was a note taped to the back of it, written in the same shaky handwriting. "Take the picture." I turned around, half expecting to see the man from before, but the room was empty. The only sound was the faint hum of the fluorescent lights. I didn't want to do it. I wanted to drop the camera and run, but something compelled me to stay. I raised the camera, aimed it at the chair, and clicked. The flash lit up the room, and for a moment I couldn't see anything. When my vision cleared, the chair was no longer empty. I was sitting in it. The version of me in the chair looked up, locking eyes with me. Their face was pale, lifeless, but their eyes were filled with something I couldn't describe: anger, fear, desperation. They opened their mouth like they wanted to say something, but no sound came out. And then the lights went out. When I woke up, I was back in my car, parked outside my apartment. The Polaroid camera was gone, but a new photo was sitting in my lap. It showed me standing in the warehouse holding the camera. And at the bottom, scrawled in that same handwriting, were the words, "Welcome to the collection.